Hello. In this video, we will look at the possible political effects of the European Union's Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area, or the DCFTA. We focus on trade liberalization, in other words, the abolition of import tariffs and other duties between trading partners. The Eastern Partnership countries suffer from rent-seeking elites and restricted access to political and economic power. We ask whether and how trade liberalization with the EU can help to contribute to political and economic opening in the Eastern neighborhood countries. Two outcomes are possible. First, trade liberalization might conserve the status quo of restricted access to political and economic power, if dominant elites hold assets in sectors that later on benefit most from trade liberalization with the EU. Second, trade liberalization might contribute to opening, if it helps to enlarge the number of economic actors across whom rents are dissipated. This would be the case if sectors with a diversified ownership structure turned into major exporters to the EU. Greater export opportunities can contribute to a more diversified ownership structure by encouraging new players to enter the sector, thus increasing internal competition. 3 countries, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, have concluded DCFTAs with the EU. Let's take the example of Ukraine. It is the most significant trading partner for the EU among these 3 countries. The EU has the greatest stake in promoting political and economic opening to achieve long-term stability, due to Ukraine's proximity and its size. Trade liberalization between the EU and Ukraine did not begin with the DCFTA. Since Ukraine became a member of the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, in 2008, the 2 parties have gradually reduced tariffs and quotas. So which sectors benefited most from trade liberalization, and who are the key owners of the industries in these sectors? This table shows that metals, mineral products, agri-food, and machinery, as well as electrical equipment, have had the highest share in Ukraine's exports to the EU for the past 10 years. They accounted for nearly 70% of Ukraine's exports to the EU in 2007, and the 4 sectors accounted for nearly 80% of exports for 2017 in the context of the DCFTA. The significance of individual sectors has changed over time. Metals and minerals occupied the top 2 positions during the period before and after accession to the WTO. These 2 sectors were traditionally in the hands of Ukraine's oligarchs, who are defined as economic actors with links to the dominant political elite. Both sectors lost significance in the following years. Agri-food is now the top exporting sector to the EU. That said, metals and mineral products still account for 37% of Ukraine's exports to the EU today. Let's take a closer look at who dominates Ukraine's leading export sectors to the EU. The agri-food industry is controlled by firms that belong to the dominant elite, though exports by foreign companies also make up a significant share, especially in the grain business. That said, around a quarter of total turnover and assets in the agri-food sector comes from large agri-holdings owned by oligarchs. Most of Ukraine's agri-holdings are said to benefit from political connections in one way or another. Forbes compiled a list of the 100 richest Ukrainians in 2016. Yuri Kosuk is the owner of Ukraine's largest poultry producer, MHP, which controlled about 80% of total poultry exports to the EU in 2017. MHP greatly benefited from decreased tariffs and quotas in the context of the DCFTA. Many owners of agri-food holdings in Ukraine use various channels to access economic rents, such as preferential access to assets or land, access to state aid, or subsidized loans from state-owned banks. Elites representing Ukraine's metals and mineral products industries were close to the network of former President Viktor Yanukovych. In these industries, firms associated with oligarchs account for over 40% of turnover and over half of all assets. These oligarchs, including Rinat Akhmetov, who ranks first on this list, are no longer part of the current dominant elite under President Petro Poroshenko. Trade statistics suggest that they still benefited from trade liberalization with the EU, but less than the dominant elites in the agri-food business. Finally, the machinery sector is well represented by both dominant and rival elites. For example, Motor Sich is owned by Vyacheslav Boguslayev, who is linked with the old dominant elite. By contrast, the Bogdan Corporation and largely state-owned companies in the defense industries are associated with the new political network under Poroshenko, 6th on this rich list. Companies in the machine building sector benefited from declining tariffs under both the WTO and the DCFTA, and used their economic power to influence political decisions in the sector. When it comes to rent-seeking, it is notable that the distinction between dominant and rival elites in the Ukrainian context is blurred. Government policies often benefit both dominant and rival elites because rival elites have formed an informal alliance with the current dominant elites, largely represented by President Petro Poroshenko. Preferred treatment of new elites, when it comes to state aid or tax concessions, is balanced with similar concessions to the old elites. Our findings are ambivalent. On the one hand, trade liberalization between the EU and Ukraine has benefited big firms owned by members of the dominant or rival elites. They use their fortune and economic importance to shape Ukrainian politics and policies for the sake of private gains. On the other hand, the agri-food sector that benefited most from the trade liberalization is more diversified in terms of ownership structure than the previous key sectors, metals and mining. It is true that the big agri-food holdings that are in the hands of Ukrainian oligarchs account for the major share of food exports to the EU. They use their economic power for rent-seeking. But trade liberalization has also made it more difficult to apply discriminatory measures against foreign firms in the form of export duties. So what are the implications for the EU trade policy towards Ukraine? Trade liberalization between Ukraine and the EU in the context of the DCFTA contributed positively to Ukraine's trade balance and helped to offset the effects of reduced trade with Russia, especially since 2014. An unintended side effect is that higher exports to the EU benefited politically connected companies, who can abuse their political and economic power for rent-seeking. The EU could help to prevent rent-seeking opportunities in the agri-food sector by, for example, discouraging preferential use of state aid or the capture of government assets. A more ambitious task will be to ensure that the small and medium-sized firms and landowners benefit from trade despite their smaller scale and lower efficiency. A fair distribution of the gains generated in agriculture exports between landowners and all exporting companies would be a socially desirable outcome. This would result in a more competitive and open environment. To read our research on the effect of the DCFTAs on other countries and the possible implications for the EU, check out the EU STRAT working paper series on our website.